Welcome to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. Each week we feature an episode from the best independent creators. Hit subscribe for more great true crime content. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you about Scary Time, another podcast by Indie Drop-In featuring independent creators. If you like episodes about the paranormal, ghosts, monsters, hauntings, creepy places, enchanted objects, aliens, and more, check out Scary Time. You can find Scary Time in any podcast app, or you can click the link in the show notes below. All right, let's get to today's true crime episode. Today's episode is from True Crime University. True Crime University is a podcast dedicated to intellectual discussions about crime, criminology, and psychology. If you like today's episode from True Crime University, make sure to check the show notes for links to subscribe and follow on social media. Enjoy the show.
Ready.
Hello, class. This is your Professor Debbie. Welcome to True Crime University, where we have intellectual discussions about crime. This is a class for mature audiences with mature language. Our purpose is to learn about criminals, not glorify them. All the information I have is from public sources. How is everybody today? Before we get into tonight's case, I have a short announcement. I'm going to be starting a new medicine. By the time you hear this, I will already be on it. And I just found out that I have OCD in addition to all the other psychiatric complaints that I have, because I guess just didn't have enough. Had to have another one. So anytime I start a new psychotropic medication, it can kind of throw me for a loop. And the reason I'm telling you this is not to overshare or give too much information, but I don't know what kind of mental state I'm going to be in until I get used to this new medicine. So if I think that it's going to affect my podcasting and I have to take a week or two off, I will let you know, either by giving out a quick episode or notices on my social media. So just to let you know that if I disappear for a little bit, that's why. And this is obviously the end of October, so this will be our last of the Halloween episodes. Big trigger warning, this case is about the murder and sexual abuse of a young child. So with that being said, you've been warned, and you know me, I tend not to shy away from details, not to be disgusting and gross everybody out. But in this case in particular, I think to know the more disturbing details is to appreciate how heinous this crime really was. So definitely not a family-friendly episode. And of course, this is another commonly covered Halloween case because it did happen on October 31st. And as soon as you saw the title, if you listen to a lot of podcasts, you're going to be like, oh, that one again. Yeah, this one again. But at the end, we are going to go into some discussion of sex offenders and sex offender rehabilitation and some more psychological things that have to do with typologies of sex offenders and things like that. So, with that said, this crime takes place in the state of Wisconsin, in the town of Fond du Lac, which, in case you're wondering, is French for farthest end of the lake. And this town sits on the very tip of a big-ass lake called Lake Winnebago. And when I first looked it up on the map and I saw the lake, I thought it was actually a Great Lake. That's how big it is. And then I zoomed out and I'm like, oh, that's Lake Winnebago. That's tiny compared to one of the Great Lakes. It looks like a nice little average town. So the date, of course, is Halloween, of 1973. And at this time, I was 3, and I think I was Casper for Halloween that year. You know, Casper the Ghost, the cartoon. And like most kids, I was excited. I couldn't wait till it got dark so that my mom could take me around the neighborhood and get candy in my little plastic pumpkin. And in Fond du Lac, there was another little girl who, just like me, was very excited to go out and get candy for Halloween. And this was 9-year-old Lisa French. Lisa was born on June 2nd of 1964 in the town of Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And at the time, she was in 4th grade. She lived with her mother, Mary Ann, and her stepdad, Bruce. And she had a little brother, Michael, who at the time was a baby. And she would later have a sister named Susan, who would be born later. Lisa wanted to be a butterfly for Halloween, but her mom said no, it's too cold for that. And it's the end of October, right on this lake, so one can only imagine how cold it was. So they improvised, and they made Lisa a little hobo costume. She had on jeans with blue tape, a green parka, a big felt floppy hat, and her mom drew freckles on her cheeks. The plan was she was going to go out and meet up with her best friend, Ann Parker. And they were supposed to go do a little bit of candy collecting before they went to something called the Pumpkin Place. Now, the Pumpkin Place was kind of like a block party set up by the neighborhood to give the kids a safe place in which they could trick or treat. And that's such an irony when you hear what's going to happen later on. Lisa was told to be home by 7, which gave her about an hour. So she wanted to get out and hit as many houses as she could so she could get as much candy as she could. And her mother later said, quote, "She was real happy when she left that night. She gave each of us a kiss and said she would see us at 7, end quote. So she goes to meet her friend Anne, but unfortunately Anne had, quote, misbehaved and unfortunately was grounded. So Lisa thought that she would go to a few houses, do a little bit of trick-or-treating before going to the pumpkin place. And I know probably what a lot of yins are thinking. Yins are probably like, wait a minute, she's 9. Why is she out by herself? And I already told you a lot of other podcasts have covered this case, and a lot of them say, and I think a lot of them are younger than me, so they weren't around in the 70s, and I don't know what they think we did in the 70s, whether we all, I don't know, did shrooms and smoked weed or said groovy, I don't know what, but everybody's like, oh, the 70s were like a freer, more relaxed time, and kids went out by themselves. And when I was 9, which would have been 1979, but it was still the 70s, and I went trick-or-treating with my best friend. We lived in this apartment complex, and it wasn't like a high-rise type thing. It was like, they call them bungalow apartments, like one level. You know, you go to this building, and then you go to that building, and then this building. And even though we were 9 and we were both together, we still had one of our mothers was with us. And I asked my mom, I said, when I was 9, would you ever let me go out Halloweening by myself? And she's like, hell no. So if you have the misconception that in the 70s, kids just ran around free after dark, that is definitely not the case. But remember, she was supposed to meet Anne, and Anne couldn't come out. So her parents had no idea that she was by herself. Now, Lisa was due home at 7. So 7:15 comes, 7:30. It's getting later and later, and her parents are getting worried. So her mom eventually called a woman who was the head of something called the Block Parents. And it was kind of like associated with the PTA in her school, like an organization of parents who, you know, like looked out for the kids' safety. And this woman called 50 other parents. and they all turned on their lights and they put up signs in their windows. And I know exactly the kind of sign that they're talking about. When I was a kid in the 70s, they were called block parents, and they were associated with the PTA, and they had these signs, and I think these ones had Snoopy on them. It was just like a white poster with a picture of Snoopy, and they taught us in school what it meant. And my mom said it means if, like, you're afraid or somebody's bothering you or whatever, that means that's a safe house that you can go to. So that's what that was. Eventually they called the police, and the police searched all night, and by the next day there was still no sign of Lisa. About 5,000 people had joined in the search, and this would be neighbors and hundreds of school kids. Supposedly school was out that day for, I don't know, a holiday or some reason. And that kind of bothered me because, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want my kid coming upon a dead body. I mean, that'd ruin somebody for life if you found that as a kid. The National Guard was involved. They had copters and planes. People were riding horses in fields. Land Rovers, apparently that they have like marshlands in this area. Rivers and creeks were dragged. There were boats on Lake Winnebago, and there was a gas station that gave 25 gallons of gas to anybody who was looking for Lisa. There was a local photo lab that took a copy of her school picture and made 6,000 copies of it, which were then distributed in the community. Her mother said that she didn't think Lisa was lost because she knew the city well. Farmers were asked to check their fields and barns, and they kind of tried to retrace her steps from what they could, and they knew that she had stopped by the house of one of her teachers between 6:15 and 6:30. And it would later turn out that right after that, her second stop was at the home of one of her friends. The headquarters for the search was a place called the Cow Palace. I don't really know what that is. I'm kind of curious about it, but this is like an agricultural town, so not really surprising. The police chief, Harold Rottenberg, said, quote, "I am satisfied in my own mind that she is not missing voluntarily," end quote. The police questioned many people. All the neighbors asked, had they seen Lisa? And especially they honed in on people with histories of sex offenses. And remember, this was before Megan's Law, so that they didn't have the register. They just had to go by people that they knew in the community who had records. And we all know that this isn't going to have a happy ending. So on the morning of November 3rd, there was a farmer named Gerald Braun on McCabe Road in the town of Taycheetah, which was 10 miles from Fond du Lac. And he noticed that there were 2 black plastic garbage bags at the end of his field near the road. So he's like, I don't like the looks of this. What's this here? So he opens one of the bags and he sees the naked body of Lisa. And in the other bag were her clothes and candy. Not sure why there were 2 bags, why everything wasn't in one. So he notified the authorities, of course, but before they could even come, somehow everybody in town knew about this, and all these people showed up. They didn't come into his farm or, like, disturb the crime scene, but there was a guy, the local pastor, who climbed over the fence, and he was so upset. He was, like, sobbing, and he knelt there in the grass and prayed over Lisa's body. And Wayne Geis from the Fond du Lac County Sheriff's Department said, quote, "It was the worst possible thing that could have happened. I saw that little girl, and I don't know how any man could do that. The killer should never, ever be released," end quote. Lisa's funeral was on November 6th, and the church was packed, like standing room only. There were 9 whole rows taken up just by her Girl Scout troop. and friends. She was buried in her favorite purple and white dress. Now that we've met Lisa and her family, it's time to meet the bad guy. His name was Gerald Turner Jr. At the time, he was 24, divorced, had 2 kids, and he worked as a machinist for Sioux Line Railroad. He lived on Rose Avenue, which was a few blocks from Lisa's house on Amory Avenue. Now, Lisa actually knew him. He had previously lived in the other half of a duplex that Lisa and her family lived in. So he was literally like right next door. And she was a friendly kid, had a lot of friends, liked to socialize with people. So she would often go over and chat with him and stuff. She still visited him when he moved, and he lived with his girlfriend, Arlene Penn, and they had a baby. And Lisa liked to come over and play with the baby. I think it was a girl. And she would even push the baby up and down the street in the stroller. So this was somebody she knew well and obviously trusted. The police had already theorized that the killer was from the area. And it usually is somebody from the area. And they first visited him right after the crime in November, when they were going around questioning all the neighbors. And he first said, when asked if he had seen Lisa that night on Halloween, he said that he had so many kids come trick-or-treating that he couldn't remember if Lisa was one of them or not. So on March 27th of 1974, the police pay another visit to him, and they ask him the same questions, where were you on Halloween? Did you see Lisa? Blah, blah, blah. And there's really no mention of this anywhere, but I'm thinking that they may have been suspicious of him because you know how a lot of cops, they just have that kind of like antenna or gut feeling, that somebody's shady or somebody's maybe not telling the truth. I kind of think that maybe that was going on. So they came back on April 7th, just like a week later, and they asked him to come down to the station because they told him there was some discrepancies in his statements that he'd given them. So now started a little game called Gerald Fucks with the Police. He signed a form that allowed them to take hair samples from him and fiber samples from his bedspread. On August 2nd, police asked him to come again, and they asked him, will he take a polygraph? He later claimed that he tried to leave, but that they told him if he did try to leave, he'd be charged with Lisa's death. And the police said, no, this never happened. And he was reluctant to take the polygraph, and it eventually came out, or maybe I think the police already knew this. The previous year, he had been charged with the statutory rape of a 15-year-old babysitter. Now, I said he'd been charged, but for whatever reason, this never went to court. He was never convicted of it. Finally, he's like, okay, I'll take the polygraph. So they took him to Madison, which is the capital of Wisconsin, and he did get on the machine, and he was asked some questions. But the Polygraph Examiner, and these are people who are trained in this, said that he did not complete the test to his satisfaction, the satisfaction of the examiner. Not sure exactly why. It's probably some technical terminology. So he was supposed to come back on August 8th. So on August 7th, the police get a call from a woman named Lorraine Forsyth, and she is his current girlfriend, because apparently Arlene flew the coop. And how does this dude keep getting all these girlfriends? Have you seen a picture of him yet? I have a few of them in my social media. And I know it was 1973 or 74, but he looks so ridiculous. He's got these big bell-bottom, like checkered pants, and these big sideburns, and he looks like a cheap Elvis impersonator. So anyway, this Lorraine, the new girlfriend, she goes, Gerald won't be there for the polygraph tomorrow. And Captain Heller of the police went to his house. And he's like, well, I don't know exactly what he said, but probably something to the effect like, what the fuck? First of all, your girlfriend's calling for you, say you're not going to come in, and why aren't you coming in for the polygraph? I hated when I was a probation officer and somebody would call like a wife or mother or something, and they'll be like, oh, I'm calling for so-and-so, he has an appointment with you tomorrow and he can't make it. I'd be like, excuse me, are you on probation? No. He's on probation, right? Yeah. Like, well, he has to call me because, I don't play that. Then Gerald says that he hasn't been treated fairly in the previous charge, the thing with the babysitter. So he finally agrees again, and he gets there. Then he changes his mind again. He said, no, I'm not taking the polygraph. So the Polygraph Examiner, if you've ever seen it on maybe TV, they hook you up to a machine and it monitors your breathing and something called GSR, which means galvanic skin response. It's like on your finger. And the theory behind it all is that your body subconsciously shows signs of stress when you lie. So the Polygraph Examiner shows him the printout, and he's like, look, here are the points where your body showed stress. And these are the questions that I asked you. I don't know what they were, but they were probably like key questions, like, did you kill Lisa or something? So then he was questioned, and he asked them, the police, hypothetically, given like air quotes, hypothetically, did they ever consider that maybe Lisa died accidentally? And they had a 2-hour discussion, during which Gerald made a, quote, complete confession of his involvement with the victim on October 31st, 1973, end quote. And this was 5 pages long. According to him, that night, which was Halloween night, his girlfriend and their baby were out somewhere. He was home by himself, and he had his front door like ajar. So Lisa, who had been there before and she knew him, she poked her head in and said, trick or treat. So he saw her standing in the doorway, and he said they talked about candy, and he lured her into the bedroom. And he said that he was, quote, highly sexually motivated that night, end quote. In other words, he was horny. So he decides to pounce on the 9-year-old neighbor who's trick-or-treating. He admitted that he undressed her and he, quote, committed an act of anal intercourse, whereupon she died, he suspected, of shock, end quote. He said that he noticed that she wasn't breathing and claims that he tried to revive her. Then Arlene came home. So he put Lisa, who's now dead, in the bathtub, and he puts on a robe and went out and told Arlene that he was sick. Oh, and when he touched Lisa's body, he was careful enough to put socks over his hands, I guess, fingerprints. They were supposed to go to either his mother's or her mother's house. But he's like, I'm sick, you just go ahead, take the baby. So she leaves again, and he puts Lisa's body and her stuff into some garbage bags and drove them out to the farm. And he even drew the police a diagram of where he put them. Then he had his formal arraignment in October, at which he pled not guilty and not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. And that is different than guilty by reason of insanity. It's just varies by state, what they call it. His arrest on August 9th was actually the #1 news story in the area for 1974. This would be a very big crime, very newsworthy event. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it affected the people of the community for a long time. And even like how they viewed Halloween, like literally every Halloween, it comes up in the news or something, like people are reminded of it. His trial started on January 27th of 1975, and the security was real heavy. There were a lot of armed guards around because, as you can guess, he wasn't a very popular person. One of the most disturbing parts of the trial was when the medical examiner testified about Lisa's cause of death. And her official cause of death was asphyxiation secondary to cardiopulmonary arrest. In other words, a heart attack. But when you hear why she had a heart attack, it's pretty disgusting. But I wanted to let you know so that you can appreciate the depravity and the heinousness of this act. The medical examiner said that, quote, the victim died during or immediately after the act of sodomy, and thus prior to the time the body was placed in the plastic bags, end quote. An autopsy showed tears of the anus and vaginal walls. There was some dried blood found there. And he explained that the trauma to these parts of her body, quote, activated her sympathetic nervous system, causing primary shock, which resulted in the stoppage of the heart, end quote. Can you imagine being 9 years old and dying in such a manner? As far as forensic evidence, they found hair on her body and clothes that was consistent with Arlene, the girlfriend who was there at the time. By the way, Arlene, at the time of the trial, had moved to Salt Lake City. And they also found on her a pubic hair with, quote, an egg form commonly referred to as crabs, end quote. So this asshole, not only does he kill her, but he has crabs. I mean, it's just like the icing on the cake. Like, he's a murderer, a pedophile, a rapist, and he has crabs. The defense pointed out that hair isn't individual, which is true, but it kind of doesn't matter at this point because he's signed a fucking 5-page confession. Just to add insult to injury, while the trial was going on, Gerald turned around to Lisa's family and said, quote, I didn't mean to do it, end quote. Can you believe that? I didn't mean to do it. He meant to kill her, but he meant to do all the other stuff, like drag her in the bedroom and rape her. Yeah, he meant to do that. So, as many defendants do, he tried to say that his confession was coerced. They do that a lot. And he said, quote, I got sick and tired of being harassed by police calling on me, end quote. So I guess he figured that the best way to handle that was just to tell them what happened. Like they would say, oh, is that it? Is that how she died? Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Turner. We'll be on our way now. So his ex-girlfriend, Arlene, testified, and I'm not sure what this has to do with anything, really, but she said that they were in the practice of attending porn movies, and then they would go home and have sex, because this, apparently excited them. And it's kind of funny, remember, this is 1974. She said that they went to porn movies. And now, not that I would know, because I was like way little then, but apparently back in those days, you had to go to a theater and they would show these movies. Nowadays, you can rent them on DVD. Well, nowadays, you can get them on the internet, but it used to be you could rent them on VCR tapes. You go in a video store like Blockbuster or something, and they have that little room with the curtain on it that said, like, you have to be 18 to come in here. And that's not that I ever been in any of those, of course, but I've seen them in the video store. But I'm not sure what really that has to do with anything, because I think it's pretty normal for couples to watch porn and then have sex. But this exchange would occur between Arlene and the defense attorney that later on would be kind of a subject of contention. Arlene said, quote, well, one time when the police called him and he was charged with having relations with a babysitter, and he felt I think he felt they were being unfair or picking on him, end quote. And the defense attorney said, may I approach the bench, please? The record showed that no objection was made to that. So on February 4th, the jury deliberated for 8 hours. And you ready for this? They found him guilty of second-degree murder. Not first, but second. Enticing a child for indecent purposes, which was a felony, and something called acts of sexual perversion, which I don't think is on the books anymore. What's bizarre in this case is that there's something called, depending on the state, either criminal homicide or felony murder. And in Pennsylvania, it's criminal homicide. But they both mean that somebody died while you were committing another felony, like rape, for instance. Why? Or, I mean, if it is, I'm not aware of it. Why this wasn't an option is totally beyond me. He was sentenced to 38 years and 6 months. So just let that sink in. There were some interesting letters to the editor in the newspaper. One of them was from a juror who was anonymous. And it said, quote, "Most of the facts presented and proven were distasteful and nauseous, but they did prove the involvement of Taylor beyond any doubt. And I will never be the same," end quote. Another anonymous person believed he deserved a second chance and thought it was, quote, "absurd that the jury took, quote, only 8 hours to decide, quote, a man's life or death." I don't know if that person wasn't aware of the details of what he did. I don't know. Now, while he was in prison, Gerald wrote a letter to Lisa. And yes, that is as disturbing as it sounds. I don't know if he actually mailed it to her family or somebody just came across it. I don't know. But this is what he said in the letter. Quote, "I can still see you standing in the doorway with that felt hat, beaming at having recognized me. Then I see the delight in your eyes turn to fear as I close the door behind you. The rest of my life, I will have to live with what I did to you. On that night, I became a monster." He's not wrong about that. Now, I'd like to say that he stays in jail for a long, long time, and everybody else lives happily ever after. But no, we're not that lucky, because in 1992, he was paroled for good behavior after 17 years and 8 months. And he stayed in something called the Bridge Halfway House in Milwaukee. Nobody was happy about this. The city officials, county officials, state officials, and basically the whole rest of the neighborhood picketed against him being out of prison and living there. And he actually worked at a recycling plant for a while, but people picketed there too. So the recycling plant said to hell with this, and they fired him. In November of 1993, he was ordered back to prison after an appeals court realized that they erred in the way they calculated his release date. The way this came about was the citizens filed a civil lawsuit and said, hey, do something with this asshole. He doesn't belong out of prison. And the court was like, yeah, I guess you're right. The chief psychologist at the Taycheedah Correctional Institution, where he had been housed, Dr. Robert Owens, testified, and he said, quote, "He has a cold disregard for people, mainly females. He does not have conscious control to inhibit his impulses for pleasure and to conform to society's laws," end quote. In other words, he just cannot behave himself. The judge, Milton Meister, was quoted as saying, "He impressed me as showing no remorse, no feeling of repentance." In 1994, he was scheduled for release again, but he was not, because the state sought to have him committed to a secure mental institution. And this was under a new law. Wisconsin passed a new law. Just because of him, it's actually called Turner's Law. And it's a sexual predator law. And it was, in case you haven't figured, prompted by the public outcry over his release. And what it does is it allows violent sex offenders to be civilly committed to a secure treatment center when they're up for parole. So say they're done serving their prison time, but they're still considered to be dangerous, then they can actually be civilly committed to a secure treatment facility. We'll discuss that a little bit later. Even though it's called Turner's Law, the technical name for it is Chapter 980. So the saga continues. In January of 1998, he was freed, once again, after the court ruled that he was not a sexual predator. And what's doubly disturbing here, number one, is that a jury found that he didn't meet Wisconsin's definition of a violent sexual offender. And I would like to ask those people, what the fuck is wrong with you? If he is not a violent sexual predator, then who do you think is? Or what do you think is? I'm just curious about that. And the other disturbing part of that is that this was despite testimony from the 15, well, she's not 15 anymore, but you know who I mean, the babysitter that he had molested before. And the testimony of an ex-girlfriend and 2 ex-wives who said that when they didn't feel like having sex with him, he would beat them and rape them. This is despite all of these women saying, he assaulted me and raped me. And these jurors are like, oh, okay, well, yep, that doesn't sound like a sexual predator to me. And his attorney, this is quite amusing, his attorney told the court, quote, I don't think he'll do so much as jaywalk on parole, end quote. Well, we know Gerald, and we know that he's probably going to do more than jaywalk. So in July of 1998, 6 months later, he's in a Madison group home. And he was working as a cook, which probably counts for why he has a knife. So I guess he gets into a shouting match with a caseworker, and he's yelling at this person and waving the knife in, I guess, like what you would call a threatening manner. So they asked the judge, would you please revoke his parole? Judge is like, nope. So time and time again, this dude keeps getting passes from the system. And the people, the community and Lisa's family, they're going, what the fuck is going on here? Why isn't this guy in prison where he belongs? He cannot behave. He is dangerous. So wait, it gets even worse. In the summer of 1999, he tried to get a job at Waste Management of Madison. That's like a garbage disposal company. And they said, no, we're not going to hire you. So he sued them because they refused to hire him due to his criminal record. And even more disturbing is that he won. Well, he didn't actually win. Okay, they didn't go to trial, but Waste Management settled with him. So they gave him money, so you can say that he won. Believe it or not, Wisconsin is one of several states that says that an employer cannot use somebody's criminal past against them when deciding whether or not to hire them. And Waste Management came back with, well, okay, we don't want to hire him because he had access to potentially dangerous either machinery or chemicals or materials. And they also had a lot of school kids, like little kids, who would tour the plant on a regular basis. And okay, this is all bullshit here. So in 2003, he's still in this halfway house in Madison, and they made a regular check like they do, and they found some interesting things. They found some porn on his computer that he had downloaded, and some magazines. And I'm not talking about Good Housekeeping, you know what kind I'm talking about, and videos. And these were all of the, I don't mean like Playboy, I mean like hardcore. That's the word I'm looking for. Hardcore porn. Plus, the genius had tried to unscramble the cable box in the halfway house to get the Playboy channel. I don't think it worked. And then he tried to order pay-per-view movies about serial killers. Unfortunately, I don't know the names of the movies, but one of them was about the slashing murder of a young girl. So the I guess it would be the parole officers, are like, fuck this dude. This is it. He's going back to court. So this time the judge revoked his parole and sentenced him to 15 years. And here is a quote from Gerald Turner. I don't know at what point he said this or to who he said this, but he said it, and he said, "If the murder had happened on some other day, like Valentine's Day, nobody would give a damn." What? Oh, okay. Whatever, dude. This is perfect example of blaming others and not being able to take responsibility for your own behavior, which he is a master of. Now, he was supposed to be released on February 1st of 2018, but the Wisconsin Department of Justice filed a petition stating that he was still a sexually violent person. And the latest on him legally is June 4th of 2021, which is just a few months ago. He had a status hearing, and he will be in what they call Sand Ridge Treatment Center for the foreseeable future. He has already served his time, but because of this law, he's considered a sexually violent predator. So that's why he's able to be housed where he is. And he's in this thing called the Sand Ridge Treatment Center. He's been there since 2018. And in case you're wondering about what the Sand Ridge Treatment Center is, well, I happen to have the facts here because I knew you'd want to know what it is. It actually looks like a prison. It has razor wire, and it's this menacing, intimidating looking building. It opened in 2001. It's in the town of Mauston, which is 70 miles from Madison. It houses about 300 men. They're all men. They call them patients instead of prisoners. And the patients can wander the halls. They're not locked up. They are encouraged to socialize and mingle. While they're there, they get treatment, which consists of CBT. We'll talk about that later. Role playing, and I'll tell you what that is later. It actually is a pretty safe facility. Since 2011, there have been only 6 incidents of patient versus patient assaults, none of which have been sexual. They've just been like fights. And of this population in here, 10% have a serious mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar. 82% have a personality disorder. Most of them are psychopaths, and 9% are considered mentally, it says retarded, but we know that means mentally challenged, whatever, mentally handicapped. Some, like Mr. Turner here, refuse treatment and don't cooperate. So that brings us to the big question, which is, can sex offenders be rehabilitated? And this is, as you probably can figure, has been highly debated, and there aren't really any satisfactory answers as of right now. But I will give you the short answer on this. And this is just a very big generalization. There is evidence that sometimes treatment does work, meaning it lowers recidivism. And you know what that means is the repetition of crimes. And probably we all know that sex offenders of all types of criminals usually have the highest recidivism rate. Reviews of the treatment processes suggest that there are certain treatment approaches that work, like cognitive behavioral therapy and relapse prevention. Strangely enough, the moderate to high risk offenders are found to benefit the most from treatment. And statistics actually show that if a low risk offender is given treatment designed for a high risk offender, they're actually more likely to recidivate, which I don't understand, but I'm just telling you what I found. As of 2008, there were 1,307 sex offender treatment programs in the United States, which encompassed over 53,000 people. That's a lot of people. And of course, we know that the effectiveness is subject to debate. For obvious reasons, as you can imagine, it's hard to study this. It's hard to get hard and fast statistics on something like this. But I did look at some studies, maybe 3 or 4 of them, and they did show a statistically significant improvement in the recidivism rate in those people who had had treatment. And studies show that the most effective type of treatment is cognitive behavioral therapy. You may have heard of that. I've heard of it, but I've never had it. And it's not just for sex offenders. It can be for anybody. They train you to focus on challenging and changing your cognitive distortions, which is like false beliefs. Like, I am entitled to have sex with any female that I want to. Improving your emotional regulation, that just means kind of like controlling your behavior, like learning to tell yourself, no, I can't do that, that's wrong, or that's illegal, or something of the sort. And the development of personal coping strategies to solve problems. Like, do you ever see those memes that go around I know they're on Facebook and I've seen them on Instagram, and it'll be a joke like, okay, therapist, what do we do when we're frustrated and angry? And it says me, poke pins in a voodoo doll. And the therapist is like, no. It's a joke, but that's kind of what cognitive behavioral therapy is it's teaching you to use effective coping skills. And voodoo dolls are not, in case you wondered. What they teach you is how to think, how to use your brain to change your ways of thinking and figure out how to solve problems that don't involve bad choices like violence or rape or illegal activities, or maybe just stupid activities. And I told you I would talk about what role-playing is. When was it? It was right before I started working at the probation office. I actually only worked there once because I got hired by the probation office right after I got this job. And it was a really fascinating job, even though I worked there once. And it was in our juvenile detention center, but it was what it was. It was a treatment center, residential treatment center for juvenile sex offenders. It was, they were locked in. They couldn't go anywhere. It was kind of like jail, but it was based around therapy. And they had to participate in all kinds of different counseling and individual therapies. One of the things they did was role play. And I never got to see this because I only was there once. But I would have loved to see this being enacted because I'm sure it was fascinating. What they did was they had the kid or the offender reenact his crime with himself portraying his victim. And I guess the perpetrator was played by, I don't know if it was other staff members or other kids. I don't know how it went, but it was supposed to make them feel like, look what you did to this person. Look, how do you feel now that this is, it's still role play, but it's being done to you. And the point is to take accountability for your actions. And it really sounds like a great way they say role playing is very effective in therapy in a lot of ways, not just with sex offenders, but in a lot of situations. It kind of makes you take back your victimization, like if you're a victim, or under the guidance of your therapist, go through something that was traumatic, or I think you get my point. And I was doing the research for this, and I'm writing down all this shit, and I'm like, I feel like I'm in grad school again. And then I thought, if I'm feeling like I'm in grad school again, this might be a little bit too academic for my listeners. So, I don't want to bore you. So I cut some of it out. But I did want to just give you this one thing here. There are 2 major types of sex offenders. And this is pretty basic and easy to understand. And this is according to Groth and Birnbaum from 1979. There's a preferential type, and what that means is the person is primarily attracted to children, and that means prepubescent children, that haven't reached puberty yet, and that means their main sexual interest is children. The FBI says that these people have a lifetime average of 282 incidents of abuse with an average of 150 victims. That's That's incredible. That's like mind-blowing. And they are good at grooming, deception. They're committed to seducing kids. It's like their lifestyle. They tend to be more professional, have higher income, and they're also the most dangerous type. The other type is situational, and they are not primarily attracted to kids, which, prepubescent. They can be married, have adult relationships, but sometimes if they maybe are stressed, or I don't know what their various reasons are, they seek out kids. And this would be Gerald Turner, because we know he was married twice. He had girlfriends. I don't know how he got so many girlfriends, because he was such an asshole, but he did. And besides the 15-year-old, which is like borderline, that would make him a hebephile, because that's not a pedophile. That would be a hebephile. Lisa is the only actual child that he ever raped. So he would definitely be a situational pedophile. He's 72 now, and Lisa's family has a petition to keep him in the treatment facility, and it's at thepetitionsite.com. I tried to put a link to it in the show notes. I don't know if it works or not, but anyway, you can sign it. I signed it, and it has 34,758 signatures, which is pretty good. So just some comments in general about how this has affected Lisa's family and the community. Remember her friend Anne? That's the little girl that was supposed to go out trick-or-treating with her, but she got grounded. Well, unfortunately, Anne, who's now like in her 50s, still feels guilt over that. And she said, quote, "A day doesn't go by that I am not thinking about my lost friend, missing her, even after all this time," end quote. She says that Lisa was funny, bubbly, and outgoing. She still feels guilty and wonders if things had been different if she'd been there. And about Gerald Turner, she said, I like this. She said, quote, "That son of a bitch should burn in hell," end quote. Now, Lisa had a sister, or half-sister, Susan, who was born after Lisa died. So Susan never got to meet Lisa. But she said that still, Gerald Turner robbed her of her childhood. She says she grew up in the shadow of Lisa, and that her mom had difficulty bonding with the two remaining kids. And she says, quote, "I think I was 35 years old before I finally understood what my mother went through and was able to forgive her. Halloween was horrible, and there was always so much guilt and pain and anger over what happened," end quote. And that's just a perfect example of how crime, especially really terrible crimes like this, have such a ripple effect on families and neighborhoods and so forth. Fond du Lac County Sheriff Mick Fink, who was, at the time of the murder, he was only 17, but he's quoted as saying, "Do I want him," meaning Gerald Turner, "out of prison? The simple answer is no. What he did was a horrible thing that shocked the conscience of this community and left a scar forever." And for years after this happened, I think it's been like 40-some years, the neighborhood where Lisa grew up and other towns in Wisconsin kept their trick-or-treating hours during the daylight because of this offense. And, well, I checked for what it is right now, and it was like all over the place. They started as early as 1 o'clock in the afternoon and ended as late as 8 o'clock at night. And a lot of towns weren't having trick-or-treating, but it was due to the pandemic, had nothing to do with Lisa French. So as far as psychology of him, I'm not going to get too much into it because we talk so much about sex offenders. But I would say, I mean, of course, I'm just speculating. I'm not a professional, and I can't diagnose anybody. But it doesn't take an expert to think that he's probably a psychopath. He definitely fits the definition of the preferential pedophile. And I think that the psychologist that testified, hit the nail on the head when he said that he has no respect for women. I'd be interested to know about his childhood and his background. Did something happen to him as a kid? I know this is kind of like a caricature of a serial killer, but you know how they say so many have bad relationships with their mother. But it's true. I mean, it's a joke because it is true. If he did have some kind of a bad relationship with a close female relative or important woman in his childhood, that would make a lot of sense as to why he feels entitled to treat women like shit. And I was curious about this. I was thinking about this. Did he intend to kill Lisa? Of course, none of us knows. All we can do is wonder. And if you came out and asked him, he's going to say, no, I didn't mean to. But I honestly don't think that he thought that far ahead. He said that he saw her and he had this urge, and he put it in terms that it was like a sexual urge. And because we know that rape is not so much about sex, but violence and power, I would be willing to bet that either maybe he'd had a bad day at work, or he fought with his girlfriend, or he had some kind of stress going on that he was just not real happy that day, and he was in a pissy mood, and he saw this defenseless little girl, and he thought, oh, I'm going to take my anger out on her, and just wasn't thinking ahead of what is going to happen after he's done with this. Because he wasn't thinking, obviously, or, you know, if he would have been thinking, he wouldn't have done what he did. So if he had raped her and she was still alive, then he would have probably been like, oh shit, what do I do now? Because she's going to tell. Would he have just let her go, knowing that she's going to tell and he'd be in prison for like a really long time? I kind of doubt it. I mean, of course, I'm just guessing, but I kind of think he would have killed her anyway. And can he be rehabilitated? No, he can't. He's proven that he just cannot behave. We saw that every time he was out in the community, and it wasn't even like really the community, it was the group home, that he was returned because he didn't know how to act. He had the argument with somebody with a knife, and then they found out he was getting into all kinds of porn and, you know, trying to rent serial killer movies and all kinds of stuff. And he won't cooperate with treatment. We know that. And the big thing, though, is that he still does not take responsibility for what he's done. And if he hasn't by the age of 72, it's doubtful that he ever will. Next month is November. So in honor of November, because here in the United States, we have Thanksgiving, and that's about food and eating, I'm going to call November Cannibal Month because I'm disturbed like that. We're going to have all cannibals for November. So stay tuned for that. And I have my Patreon almost ready to launch. I have it like made, but I'm going to wait till actually November to launch it. So for as little as $2 a month, you can be a teacher's pet, which is what I'm going to call my Patreons. And this episode is dedicated to Lisa French. Class dismissed.
Thanks again for listening to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. If you would like your show featured, reach out to us at Indie Drop-In on all social media or go to indiedropin.com. See you next time.